"What do you want from me tonight?" she whispered to the passionate millionaire. His reply fell like a stone into silent water. A great love, heartwarming and passionate love story. Hi, my beautiful family. Let me begin with a small but powerful prayer. Dear God, please heal me completely and bless every beautiful soul watching this. Bring peace, strength, and joy to their hearts and homes. Amen. I'm still in New York for treatment, but please know, your love is with me and I carry you in every breath. You're not just subscribers, you are my family, my strength, my purpose. To all our new family members, welcome home. Drop a comment, tell me who you are. I truly want to know you. Now let me share something real. In just 2 days, we faced 2 unexpected mistakes. One video had background noise, the next had 2 minutes of silence. Now, YouTube is pushing the channel down. Has this happened in your life too, when things go wrong one after the other? But remember, these trials don't break us, they build us. So please drop your kind words in the comments. Motivate me. Tell me your story. Let's lift each other up. Also, if you see my videos on other channels, they're fake. They're stealing and re-uploading with edits. Only this channel is the real Mr. Peter. And before we dive in, please like, comment, and stay till the end. Your one click can save our channel. If the intro is long, feel free to skip ahead, but please don't skip the story. James is here with today's beautiful story. Let's begin this journey together, with love, faith, and hope.
I want a baby from you. The words fell from Paul Hogan's lips like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the moonlit library that would reshape both their lives forever. Melina Bavuma froze, the crystal decanter she'd been refilling, slipping from nerveless fingers to crash against the Persian rug in an explosion of cut glass and brandy that seemed to echo like thunder in the sudden silence. At 26, she had mastered the art of invisibility in wealthy white households, a shadow that cleaned, served, and disappeared without leaving a trace of her presence. But this man, this millionaire guest of Mrs. Lilia Beauchemin, had just shattered her carefully constructed world with 5 impossible words. "What did you say?" she whispered, her dark eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at the man who had been watching her with predatory intensity for the 3 weeks since his arrival at the estate. Paul stepped closer, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the firelight as he moved with the deliberate grace of a man accustomed to taking whatever he desired. At 32, he commanded business empires and social circles with equal ease. But standing here in the flickering shadows, surrounded by the scent of leather-bound books and spilled brandy, he looked like a man possessed by something far more dangerous than mere lust. "You heard me perfectly, Melina," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like honey mixed with sin. "I want a baby from you. I want to plant my seed in your womb and watch you grow round with my child." The crude elegance of his words sent heat flooding through her body, even as her mind reeled with the impossibility of what he was suggesting. She pressed one trembling hand to her throat, feeling her pulse hammering against her palm like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "Mr. Hogan, you don't know what you're saying," she stammered. But even as she spoke the denial, she could see the absolute conviction burning in his eyes. This wasn't the wine talking, wasn't some moment of madness brought on by moonlight and proximity. This was cold, calculated desire spoken with the confidence of a man who had never been refused anything he truly wanted. "Don't I?" Paul's voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to caress her skin like silk. "I've been watching you for weeks, Melina, studying you, learning the way you move through this house like you're dancing to music only you can hear. I've seen you in the mornings when you think no one is looking, standing at the kitchen window with your hand pressed to your stomach, your face soft with longing for something you think you'll never have." The observation hit her like a physical blow because it was true. She had caught herself more than once imagining what it would feel like to carry a child, to have someone depend on her not just for survival, but for love, for the kind of fierce protection she'd given her sister Kizzy since their parents died when she was barely 16. But those were private dreams, secret longings she'd never shared with another living soul. "How dare you watch me like that?" she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "How dare you think you can just announce your intentions like I'm some broodmare you're considering for purchase?" Paul's laugh was soft, almost rueful. "You think this is about ownership? About some rich man's casual entertainment?" He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her cheek. "Melina, I haven't been able to think about anything else since the moment I walked into this house. You've consumed me entirely." His touch was electric, sending waves of sensation through her body that she'd never experienced before. She'd been kissed exactly twice in her life, clumsy, forgettable encounters that had left her wondering what all the fuss was about. But this simple contact of Paul's fingers against her skin was more intimate than anything she'd ever known. "This is madness," she whispered, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "Is it?" Paul stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, a mixture of sandalwood and something uniquely masculine that made her head spin. "Or is it the most honest thing either of us has felt in years?" "You don't understand," Melina said desperately. "I'm a maid, a black woman who works with her hands and depends on the charity of white families for survival. I'm a man who spent 32 years sleepwalking through a life that meant nothing until I saw you arranging flowers in the front hall 3 weeks ago," Paul interrupted, his voice rough with honesty. "I've been engaged twice to women my father chose, women who would advance our social standing and business interests. Beautiful, accomplished women who left me feeling absolutely nothing." "And you think I would feel differently about those arrangements?" Melina asked, trying to inject some steel into her voice. "You think because I'm poor and black that I'd be grateful for any attention from a white man, even if he's only offering to use my body for his pleasure?" Paul's face darkened, and for a moment she saw something dangerous flicker in his gray eyes. "Is that really what you think I'm doing, using you?" "What else could this be?" she demanded, gesturing between them. "You can't marry me. You can't claim any children I might bear you. You can't offer me anything but secrecy and shame, and the kind of temporary passion that rich men indulge in when they're bored with their regular entertainments." "Can't I?" The question was soft, but it carried an undercurrent of steel that made her breath catch. "What if I told you I've already written to my father, informing him that I'm withdrawing from the Henderson marriage arrangement? What if I told you I've been making inquiries about properties in California, where a man with money can build whatever kind of life he has the courage to dream?" Melina stared at him in shock. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Paul said, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "I want you, Melina. Not as a mistress, not as a temporary distraction, but as my wife. I want to put my ring on your finger and my babies in your belly and build something beautiful together that will outlast both of us." The words were like lightning, illuminating corners of her heart she'd kept carefully shrouded in darkness. For one blazing moment, she allowed herself to believe it was possible, that a man like Paul Hogan could want a woman like her, not just for pleasure, but for partnership, for the kind of love that created families and legacies. But reality crashed back like a cold wave, bringing with it years of hard-won wisdom about the world they lived in. "Your family will disown you," she said quietly. "Your business associates will turn their backs. Society will destroy both of us." "Then we'll build a new society," Paul said with the kind of passionate conviction that had probably made him millions. "Out in California, where the gold rush has created new money and new rules, where a man is judged by what he can accomplish rather than who his grandfather was. And if we fail, if the prejudice follows us there, If our children suffer for our choices, Paul was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones as he seemed to weigh her fears against his dreams. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Then they'll suffer beautifully," he said. "They'll suffer knowing they were wanted, knowing they were created out of love rather than obligation. They'll suffer with the strength you'll give them and the resources I can provide. And maybe, just maybe, they'll live to see a world where love matters more than the color of skin or the size of bank accounts." Tears gathered in Melina's eyes, threatening to spill over. "You make it sound so simple." "Because it is simple," Paul said, leaning down until his forehead touched hers. "I love you, Melina Bavuma. I love your strength and your grace, and the way you hum when you think no one is listening. I love your fierce devotion to your sister, and your gentle kindness to stray cats, and the dreams I can see flickering behind your eyes when you think no one is watching. Paul, I want to give you babies," he continued, his voice growing husky with desire and tenderness in equal measure. "I want to watch your belly grow round with my children, want to feel them move beneath my hands, want to teach them about business and watch you teach them about love. I want to build something permanent and beautiful and real." Before she could protest, before her rational mind could list all the reasons why this was impossible, Paul kissed her. It was nothing like the clumsy, grabbing kisses she'd experienced before. Paul's lips were soft, reverent, asking rather than demanding. He kissed her like she was precious, like she was chosen, like she was the answer to every prayer he'd never dared to voice. His hands cradled her face as if she were made of the finest porcelain, and she felt herself melting against him like snow in spring sunshine. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Melina's world had shifted completely off its axis. She pressed her fingers to her lips, staring up at him in wonder and terror. "Tell me you feel it too," Paul whispered, his gray eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. "Tell me this isn't just my madness." "I feel it," she admitted, the words torn from the deepest parts of her soul. "God help me, I feel everything you described. But Paul, this is impossible. The world we live in is about to change," he said firmly. "Because we're going to change it. You and me and the family we're going to build together. Starting tonight." The promise hung between them, beautiful and impossible, and more tempting than anything she'd ever imagined. Outside the library windows, she could hear the autumn wind rustling through the trees, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and the promise of winter coming whether they were ready or not. "What if I said yes?" she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "What if I agreed to this madness?" Paul's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face with joy. "Then I'd marry you tomorrow if you'd have me. I'd take you away from this place where you have to hide your light under a bushel, and I'd spend the rest of my life making sure you never regretted trusting me with your heart. And the babies you want?" The question was barely audible, but Paul heard it as clearly as if she'd shouted. "Would be a blessing beyond anything I deserve," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But only if you want them too. Only if the idea of carrying my children fills you with joy instead of fear." Melina closed her eyes, trying to imagine it, herself growing round with Paul's child, feeling new life moving within her, holding a baby that carried both their features and all their hopes for the future. The image was so vivid, so achingly beautiful that it took her breath away. "I've dreamed of having children," she admitted quietly. "Not like this. Not with someone so far above my station, but I've dreamed of it, of having someone to love who would love me back without reservation." "Then dream bigger," Paul said, capturing her hands and pressing them to his chest where she could feel his heart racing beneath her palms. "Dream of children who'll never know poverty, who'll have every advantage we can give them, who'll grow up knowing they're loved beyond measure." The fantasy was intoxicating, as addictive as wine and twice as dangerous. But standing there in the firelight with Paul's heart beating beneath her hands and his eyes promising her impossible things, Melina found herself beginning to believe. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Paul said, raising her hands to his lips and pressing a kiss to each palm. "You tell me whether you trust me enough to take the greatest leap of faith either of us will ever make." Outside, a church bell chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. As the sound faded into silence, Melina looked into Paul Hogan's eyes and saw her entire future hanging in the balance. The question was, did she have the courage to reach for it? Chapter 2. Forbidden Conversations. The porcelain teacup rattled against its saucer as Melina's hands trembled, the morning after Paul's shocking proposal, having transformed the simple act of serving breakfast into a minefield of stolen glances and unspoken promises that threatened to expose them both. Mrs. Lelia Boschman sat at the head of the polished oak table, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, her keen blue eyes missing nothing as she observed the careful dance between her guest and her maid. At 73, the estate's matriarch had witnessed enough of life's dramas to recognize the dangerous electricity crackling between Paul Hogan and the young woman who served his coffee with downcast eyes and flushed cheeks. "Mr. Hogan," Lilia said smoothly, her cultured voice cutting through the morning tension like a blade wrapped in silk. "I trust you slept well. You seemed rather energetic during your evening constitutional last night." Paul's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he accepted the cup from Melina's trembling hands, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment, a touch so fleeting it might have been accidental, yet both of them felt it burn through their skin like lightning. The memory of his words from the night before hung between them like a dangerous secret. "I want a baby from you." "Quite well, thank you," Paul replied with carefully measured politeness. The autumn air has a way of clearing the mind, making one's priorities remarkably focused. "Indeed it does," Lilia agreed, her gaze shifting meaningfully between them. "Clarity can be both a blessing and a curse, depending on what one sees clearly. Sometimes the mind focuses on things that are better left unfocused." The warning was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of aristocratic grace that could cut a person to ribbons while maintaining perfect propriety. Melina's cheeks flamed as she quickly stepped back, focusing intently on arranging the morning pastries while her heart threatened to beat out of her chest. She could feel Paul's eyes on her, could sense his frustration at having to pretend indifference when everything between them had changed in those precious minutes by the fireplace. "Clarity," Paul said quietly, "is often the first step toward necessary action. A man can't move forward until he knows precisely what he wants and how far he's willing to go to get it." "And what is it you want, Mr. Hogan?" Lilia asked, taking a delicate sip of her tea while watching him with the predatory stillness of a cat studying a particularly interesting mouse. Paul's gaze flickered to Melina, who had gone very still at the pastry table, her hands frozen in the act of arranging croissants. "I want," he said slowly, "to build something permanent. Something that will outlast the temporary pleasures and convenient arrangements that seem to satisfy most men of my position." "Permanence," Lilia mused. "How fascinating. And what form would this permanence take?" "A family," Paul said without hesitation, his voice carrying a conviction that made Melina's breath catch. "Children who'll carry forward not just my name but my values, a legacy built on love rather than mere obligation." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, a direct challenge to everything Lilia's generation considered proper and possible. Melina felt tears prick at her eyes, remembering the way Paul had looked at her the night before, when he'd spoken of wanting to watch her grow round with his child, wanting to build something beautiful together that would outlast them both. Children require mothers, Lilia observed with deceptive mildness. Have you given thought to what kind of woman would be suitable for such an ambitious undertaking? I have, Paul said, his gaze finding Melina's across the breakfast room with an intensity that made her knees weak. I believe I've found exactly the woman I need, someone with strength, intelligence, and the kind of natural grace that no amount of money can purchase. Melina nearly dropped the silver sugar bowl as his meaning registered. He was talking about her, to Mrs. Beauchemin in the clear light of day, with a boldness that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. This wasn't the wine or moonlight talking. This was Paul Hogan declaring his intentions with the same ruthless determination he probably brought to his business dealings. How unconventional, Lilia said, her smile sharp as cut glass. I do hope you've considered the practical implications of such an arrangement. Society can be remarkably unforgiving of those who choose to disregard its carefully established boundaries. Society, Paul replied coolly, is built by people who had the courage to imagine something different. The boundaries you speak of weren't handed down by God. They were created by men who profited from keeping certain groups separated and powerless. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch as Paul essentially declared war on everything Lilia's world held sacred. Melina found herself caught between terror and admiration for his audacity. No one spoke to women like Lilia Beauchemin with such casual dismissal of their values. But Paul seemed utterly unimpressed by her social standing or the power she wielded in their small community. You speak like a revolutionary, Mr. Hogan, Lilia said, her voice carrying a note of warning. Revolution can be dangerous for everyone involved, not just those who instigate it. So can stagnation, Paul countered. So can accepting injustice simply because it's traditional. Some things are worth the risk, even when that risk involves destroying innocent people. Lilia's gaze shifted pointedly to Melina, who had gone pale as she realized she was being discussed like a pawn in a chess game between titans. Even when your revolutionary fervor might ruin someone who has no power to protect herself from the consequences. Paul's face darkened at the implication. The woman I'm interested in is hardly powerless. She's one of the strongest people I've ever met, perfectly capable of making her own decisions about what risks are worth taking. Is she? Lilia's smile was cold as winter. How enlightened of you to think so. I wonder if she shares your optimistic assessment of her choices. All eyes turned to Melina, who felt the weight of their attention like a physical presence. For a moment, she considered fleeing, rushing from the room and hiding in the servants' quarters until this impossible conversation ended. But something in Paul's eyes, some mixture of hope and desperate vulnerability, made her straighten her shoulders and meet Lilia's challenging gaze directly. I'm standing right here, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. If you want to know what I think, you could ask me directly instead of discussing me like I'm not present. The boldness of her response seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. Servants didn't speak to their employers' guests with such directness, didn't insert themselves into conversations between their social superiors. But Paul's words from the night before echoed in her mind. Hun, I want to put my ring on your finger and my babies in your belly and build something beautiful together that will outlast both of us. Very well, Lilia said after a moment's pause, clearly reassessing the young woman she'd thought she knew. What do you think, Melina? Do you believe love is enough to overcome the obstacles Mr. Hogan seems determined to ignore? Melina felt her heart hammering as she considered her response. Everything depended on this moment. Her job, her sister's security, her entire future hung in the balance of how she answered this question. I think, she said slowly, that love without courage is just pretty words, but courage without love is just cruelty dressed up as strength. The question isn't whether love is enough. It's whether the people involved are brave enough to fight for what they claim to want. Paul's face lit up with something that might have been pride, while Lilia's expression remained carefully neutral. The answer hadn't committed Melina to anything specific, but it had revealed her willingness to engage with the philosophical question rather than simply defer to her employer's authority. "And are you?" Paul asked softly. "Brave enough to fight for what you want?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the implications of his proposal from the night before. Melina looked at this man who claimed to want to build a family with her, who spoke of children and permanence and revolution with equal conviction, and felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. "I've been fighting my entire life," she said simply. "The question is whether what's being offered is worth fighting for." "What would make it worth fighting for?" Paul asked, leaning forward slightly as if her answer was the most important thing he'd ever heard. Melina glanced at Lilia, acutely aware that every word was being catalogued and judged, then back at Paul. "Honesty," she said finally. "Not just about feelings, but about consequences. Not just about dreams, but about the practical realities of building those dreams in a world that doesn't want them to exist." "And if I could provide that honesty," Paul pressed, "if I could show you that I've thought through the consequences and I'm prepared to face them, then," Melina said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we might have something worth discussing." The admission hung in the morning air like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Paul's eyes blazed with triumph, and something deeper, something that looked like genuine love mixed with desperate hope. Lilia, meanwhile, studied them both with the calculating expression of someone witnessing the first moves in a game that could destroy everyone involved. "Well," Lilia said finally, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision, "this has been illuminating. Mr. Hogan, I believe you mentioned some business correspondence that required your attention this morning." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Paul rose from his chair, his movements controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of barely leashed energy. "Indeed I did. Thank you for breakfast, Mrs. Beauchemin. As always, your hospitality is educational." As he moved toward the door, Paul's hand brushed against Melina's shoulder, a touch so brief it might have been accidental, but she felt the heat of it, like a brand. "The East Garden," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "An hour after noon. We need to discuss practical realities." Then he was gone, leaving Melina alone with Lilia and the weight of choices that would determine the course of her entire life. "You're playing with fire, child," Lilia said softly, once Paul's footsteps had faded down the hall. "I know," Melina replied, beginning to clear the breakfast dishes with hands that only trembled slightly. "Fire burns everything it touches," Lilia continued. "Even the people who think they can control it." "Sometimes," Melina said, surprising herself with her boldness, "things need to burn before something better can grow in their place." Lilia studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in her blue eyes. "You may be right," she said finally, "but before you strike the match, make sure you're prepared to live in the ashes if your beautiful new growth fails to take root." As Melina carried the dishes toward the kitchen, Lilia's warning echoed in her mind. But underneath the fear, something else was growing, a fierce, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, some fires were worth the risk of burning. In a few hours, she would meet Paul in the East Garden and learn whether his practical realities matched his romantic promises. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. But first, she had to decide whether she was brave enough to strike the match. Chapter 3. The Garden Confession. "I've done something that will either save us both or damn us beyond redemption." Paul's voice carried across the secret garden like a confession spoken to the wind, as Melina emerged from behind the climbing roses to find him pacing among the autumn flowers like a man wrestling with angels and demons in equal measure. The East Garden was Mrs. Lilia Beauchemin's private sanctuary, hidden behind walls of ivy-covered stone and accessible only through a narrow gate that most of the household had forgotten existed. It was here, among the late-blooming roses and the ancient oak that had witnessed decades of secrets, that Paul had chosen to reveal whatever desperate action he'd taken in the hours since their charged breakfast conversation. Melina approached slowly, her practical brown dress rustling against the overgrown lavender that bordered the gravel path. The afternoon sun filtered through the oak's golden leaves, casting dappled shadows across Paul's face and highlighting the tension in his shoulders, the almost desperate energy that radiated from him like heat from a forge. "What have you done?" she asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Paul stopped pacing and turned to face her, his gray eyes bright with something that might have been triumph or terror. In his hands, he held what appeared to be a telegram, the yellow paper crumpled from repeated handling. "I've burned every bridge that might have led me back to my old life," he said simply. "This morning I sent word to my father that I'm withdrawing completely from the family business. I've also contacted a land agent in Sacramento about purchasing property suitable for unconventional families." The words hit Melina like physical blows, each one reshaping her understanding of what this man was willing to sacrifice for the impossible dream he'd outlined the night before. She sank onto the stone bench beneath the oak tree, her legs suddenly unable to support the weight of what he was telling her. "Paul, you can't be serious. Your inheritance, your position in society, everything you've worked for. Everything I've been trapped by," he corrected, moving to sit beside her on the bench. "Melina, I need you to understand something. I've spent 32 years living according to other people's expectations, building wealth I didn't want to support, a lifestyle that felt like a beautifully decorated prison. These past weeks, watching you, talking with you, imagining what we could build together, it's the first time I've felt truly alive." He reached into his jacket and withdrew another document, this one bearing official seals and elaborate calligraphy. "This is a letter of credit from the Bank of California, guaranteeing funds sufficient to purchase a substantial property and support a family in comfort for decades. It's my freedom, Melina, and if you'll have me, it's ours." Melina stared at the document as if it were a snake that might bite her. The sums mentioned were more money than she'd seen in her entire lifetime, enough to lift not just her but her sister Kizzy out of poverty permanently. But she'd learned long ago that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you give up everything for someone like me?" Paul set the papers aside and took her hands in his touch gentle but urgent. "Because someone like you is exactly what I've been searching for my entire life without knowing it. You're not like the women I was expected to marry, Melina. You don't want me for my money or my social connections. You don't see me as a prize to be won, or a stepping stone to a better position. How do you know what I see when I look at you?" The question escaped before she could stop it, revealing fears she'd barely acknowledged to herself. "Because," Paul said with quiet conviction, "when you look at me, you see the man I could be instead of the man I've been forced to be. When you smiled at me yesterday morning while serving breakfast, it wasn't because you wanted something from me. It was because you genuinely enjoyed whatever small joke we'd shared the night before." The observation was devastatingly accurate, and it terrified her how well he'd read her responses. She had enjoyed their conversation, had found herself looking forward to those moments when Paul's carefully maintained social mask slipped, and she glimpsed the passionate, intelligent man underneath. "That doesn't mean I'm the right woman to bear your children," she said desperately. That doesn't mean I'm equipped to be the wife of a man with your background and expectations." Paul's laugh was soft but carried an edge of something that might have been pain. "My background is inherited money built on the backs of people who look like you, Melina. My expectations have been shaped by a society that teaches men like me to see women as either saints or sinners, with no acknowledgement of the complex, brilliant, fascinating human beings they actually are." He stood abruptly, moving to the garden wall where autumn roses climbed toward the sky in defiance of the approaching winter. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of confession. "I was engaged before," he said quietly. "Twice. To women my father chose, women who met every requirement on society's list of suitable wives, beautiful, accomplished, from the right families with the right connections." Melina felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happened? "I couldn't touch them," Paul said simply, his back still turned to her. "Oh, I managed the proper courtesies, kisses on gloved hands, chaste embraces during carefully chaperoned dances. But the thought of sharing a bed with them, of creating children with them, left me feeling empty, hollow." He turned back to face her, and the raw honesty in his gray eyes took her breath away. "I thought something was wrong with me," he continued. "I thought I was incapable of the kind of passion that other men described. Then I walked into Mrs. Boschman's front hall 3 weeks ago and saw you arranging flowers, humming something so beautiful it made my chest ache. And I realized I'd been trying to force myself to want the wrong things." "Paul, I want you, Melina," he said, moving back to the bench and kneeling before her like a supplicant before an altar. "Not as some exotic conquest or forbidden pleasure, but as my wife. I want to wake up beside you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to watch your body change as it carries our children. I want to build something permanent and beautiful and real." The words washed over her like warm water, dissolving some of the careful barriers she'd built around her heart. But fear remained, cold and practical and impossible to ignore. "And when the novelty wears off," she asked, "when the reality of society's disapproval settles in, when our children face prejudice and exclusion because of choices we made before they were born?" Paul reached up to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "Then we'll face it together. We'll teach our children that they're loved beyond measure, that they're the product of a love so strong it was willing to change the world rather than accept limitations. You make it sound so simple." "Love is simple," Paul said firmly. "Everything else, the social complications, the family pressures, the financial considerations, those are just obstacles to be overcome. And Melina, I have enough money to overcome a lot of obstacles." Despite everything, she found herself smiling at his confidence. "Money doesn't solve everything, Paul." "No," he agreed, "but it solves more than most people want to admit. Money can buy us land far from judgmental neighbors. Money can ensure our children receive the best education available. Money can protect us from the worst consequences of society's disapproval." He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. "But more importantly, money can buy us time. Time to prove that what we're building is stronger than prejudice, more lasting than social fashion. Time to raise children who'll change the world simply by existing in it." The vision he painted was intoxicating, a future where love was enough, where their children could grow up free from the limitations that had shaped both their parents' lives. But underneath the beauty of his words, practical concerns gnawed at her. "What about Kizzy?" she asked quietly. "My sister is dying, Paul. Slowly but inevitably. I can't abandon her to chase after impossible dreams." "You won't have to," Paul said immediately. "The property I'm considering in California has space for extended family. The best doctors money can hire, clean air that might help her lungs, every comfort we can provide. Kizzy would be our family, Melina, our children's aunt, a valued member of our household. The thoughtfulness of his planning brought tears to her eyes. He'd considered everything, anticipated her concerns, prepared solutions for obstacles she hadn't even thought to voice. It was the kind of thorough preparation that spoke of genuine commitment rather than romantic impulse. "You've really thought this through," she said wonderingly. "I've thought of little else since the moment I realized what you meant to me," Paul admitted. "I've imagined our wedding small and private, but absolutely legal. I've pictured the house we'll build, large enough for children and guests, and all the dreams we haven't dared to voice yet. I've even chosen names for the babies I want to give you." "Names?" The word escaped as barely a whisper. Paul's smile was soft, private, meant only for her. "For our daughter, I thought Rosalie. For the roses where we're having this conversation. For our son." He paused, looking almost shy. "I'd like to name him after my grandfather, the only member of my family who ever told me that love was more important than money." The specificity of his dreams undid her completely. These weren't vague romantic notions, but concrete plans, carefully considered and desperately wanted. She could see it all: the house in California, Kizzy laughing with her nephew and niece, children who carried both their features and all their hopes for a better world. "When?" she asked, the single word committing her to more than she'd ever imagined possible. Paul's face lit up with joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. "Tomorrow," he said immediately. "We'll take the evening train to Sacramento. I've already made arrangements with the minister there who's willing to perform the ceremony with no questions asked." "Tomorrow?" Melina's voice cracked with the impossibility of it all. "I know it's fast," Paul said, taking her hands and pressing them to his chest, where she could feel his heart racing. "But Melina, I can't wait any longer. I can't spend another night knowing you're in this house, so close I can almost touch you, while we pretend this thing between us isn't real." His urgency was infectious, and she found herself caught up in the wild momentum of his planning. "What about Mrs. Beauchemin? My position here?" "Will be irrelevant once you're my wife," Paul said with quiet confidence. "We'll disappear tomorrow evening like lovers in a romantic novel. By the time anyone realizes we're gone, we'll be married and on our way to a new life." The plan was audacious, romantic, and completely terrifying. It was also, Melina realized, exactly the kind of grand gesture that someone with Paul's resources and determination could actually accomplish. He wasn't just offering her dreams, he was offering her a concrete path to making those dreams reality. "Say yes," Paul whispered, his gray eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. "Say you'll marry me. Say you'll let me give you the children and the life you deserve. Say you'll trust me to love you the way you should be loved." The words hung between them like a bridge, spanning the chasm between her careful, circumscribed existence and a future bright with possibility. Everything she'd ever been taught about knowing her place, about the dangers of reaching too high, screamed at her to refuse. But Paul's hands were warm and solid in hers, and his eyes held promises that made her believe in impossible things. "Yes," she whispered, and watched his world transform with joy. As Paul pulled her into his arms, kissing her with desperate gratitude and blazing passion, Melina felt her old life falling away like a discarded coat. Tomorrow she would become someone new: wife, future mother, partner in building something beautiful from scratch. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. But with Paul's arms around her and his promises warm in her ears, terror seemed like a small price to pay for the chance at forever. Chapter 4. Sister's Warning. You're about to make the biggest mistake of your life, and the tragic part is you're too drunk on his pretty words to see it coming. Kizzy Sterling's voice cut through the late afternoon air like a blade as she watched her sister pack a small satchel with trembling hands, her dark eyes blazing with fever and fierce protectiveness. Melina paused in folding her second-best dress, the blue one that Paul had admired when she'd worn it to church the previous Sunday. The tiny room in Mrs. Ratana Waldsberger's boarding house felt suddenly cramped and airless, the cheerful yellow curtains and hand-sewn quilts unable to mask the weight of her sister's disapproval. "It's not a mistake," Melina said quietly, though her voice lacked the conviction she wished she felt. "Paul loves me, Kizzy. He wants to marry me, build a life together." "Paul wants to own you," Kizzy corrected sharply, struggling to sit up in the narrow bed despite the obvious pain the movement caused. "There's a difference, honey, and the fact that you can't see it terrifies me." The accusation hit Melina like a physical blow, mainly because it echoed fears she'd been trying to suppress since Paul's proposal in the garden. She'd come here to share her joy with the one person whose opinion mattered most to her, but instead she found herself defending choices she wasn't entirely sure she understood. "You don't know him," Melina said, sinking into the wooden chair beside Kizzy's bed. "You haven't seen how gentle he is, how carefully he's planned everything. He's arranged for your medical care, made provisions for you to come to California with us." "Has he?" Kizzy's laugh was bitter, cut short by a coughing fit that left her gasping. When she could speak again, her voice was rough, but determined. "And what happens to those generous provisions when he gets tired of playing house with his exotic pet? What happens to me when the novelty wears off and he decides he wants a wife who won't embarrass him at society gatherings?" "He's not like that," Melina protested, but she could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "He's giving up his inheritance for me, his family connections, everything he's ever known." "Is he?" Kizzy leaned forward, her gaunt face intense with the need to make her sister understand. "Or is he making a grand romantic gesture that costs him nothing he actually valued? Think about it, Melina. A man who spent 32 years living off his family's money suddenly decides to strike out on his own. Conveniently, at the exact moment he develops an obsession with someone he can never bring home to meet his parents." The words were like ice water, chilling Melina's romantic fever and forcing her to examine Paul's motivations from a different angle. What if Kizzy was right? What if this wasn't the grand love story she'd imagined, but simply a wealthy man's rebellion against family expectations, with her as the convenient catalyst? "You're wrong," she said, but the conviction was gone from her voice. "Am I?" Kizzy reached for her sister's hands, her touch burning with fever. "Melina, I've been watching men look at you since you turned 15. I know the difference between a man who sees you as a person and one who sees you as a possession. This Paul Hogan, he doesn't want to marry you in spite of what you are. He wants to marry you because of what you are." "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's not falling in love with Melina Bavuma, the woman," Kizzy said with devastating clarity. "He's falling in love with the idea of himself as the kind of man who would marry a black woman. He's fallen in love with his own courage, his own progressive thinking, his own willingness to scandalize society. You're not his beloved. You're his proof that he's different from other rich white men." The observation cut deep because there was truth in it. Paul had spoken passionately about changing the world, about proving that love could overcome prejudice, about raising children who would grow up free from the limitations their parents had faced. But how much of that passion was really about her, and how much was about his own desire to see himself as a hero in a romantic story? "Even if that were true," Melina said desperately, "it doesn't mean he doesn't care for me. It doesn't mean we can't build something real together." "Building something real requires seeing each other clearly," Kizzy replied. "And honey, I'm not sure either of you is seeing anything but your own fantasies reflected back. He sees you as his salvation from a life of privilege and boredom. You see him as your rescue from poverty and invisibility. But what happens when the fantasy collides with reality? Before Melina could answer, there was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Waldsberger's voice called through the thin wood. "Miss Bavuma, you have a visitor downstairs, the same gentleman from yesterday." Both sisters froze. Paul had come, presumably to finalize their departure plans and escort Melina to whatever new life awaited them in California. The moment of truth had arrived faster than either of them expected. "Send him up," Kizzy called out, her voice carrying a note of challenge that made Melina's stomach clench with anxiety. "Kizzy, no, you're not well enough for confrontation." "I'm dying," Kizzy said bluntly. "That gives me the right to speak my mind to the man who wants to carry off my sister. If he can't handle questions from a dying woman, what makes you think he can handle the challenges of an interracial marriage?" The logic was unassailable, but Melina felt panic rising in her chest as footsteps sounded on the boarding house stairs. She wasn't ready for this meeting, wasn't prepared to watch her sister's cynicism clash with Paul's romantic certainty. Too much depended on the next few minutes. Her future, her heart, possibly her entire understanding of what love meant. Paul appeared in the doorway looking every inch the successful businessman, despite the simple clothes he'd chosen for his visit to this working-class neighborhood. His gray eyes found Melina's immediately, and she saw relief and something deeper. Possession, perhaps, or simply the satisfaction of a man who'd gotten what he wanted. "Melina," he said, her name carrying warmth and promise in equal measure. "Are you ready?" "Not quite," Kizzy said before Melina could respond. "Mr. Hogan, isn't it? I'm Kizzy Sterling, Melina's sister. I believe we need to have a conversation." Paul's gaze shifted to the woman in the bed, and Melina watched his expression carefully for signs of the revulsion or pity that most people showed when confronted with serious illness. To his credit, she saw neither, only polite attention and what appeared to be genuine concern. "Miss Sterling," he said formally, "I'm honored to meet you. Melina speaks of you constantly." "I'm sure she does," Kizzy replied dryly. "The question is whether she's told you the truth about our circumstances or painted some romantic picture that better fits your fantasies." Paul stepped fully into the room, his presence somehow making the small space feel even more cramped. "I know you're ill," he said quietly. "I know Melina has been supporting you both on a maid's wages, and I know she's terrified of leaving you alone. That's why I've made arrangements for your care as part of our marriage plans." "How generous," Kizzy said, her tone making the compliment sound like an insult. "And what happens to those arrangements if your marriage doesn't work out as planned? What happens to me if you decide you've had enough of playing progressive reformer?" Paul's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained level. "I'm not playing at anything, Miss Sterling. I love your sister, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it to her." "Love," Kizzy repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me, Mr. Hogan, what exactly do you love about Melina? And please be specific." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Melina held her breath, suddenly desperate to hear Paul's answer. Everything depended on whether he could articulate feelings that went beyond romantic fantasy and physical attraction. Paul was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the two sisters, as if weighing his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried a conviction that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. "I love her strength," he said finally. "The way she's carried responsibility for you both since she was barely more than a child herself. Never complaining. Never asking for help she knew wouldn't come. I love her intelligence. The books I've caught her reading when she thinks no one is watching. The questions she asks that show she's thinking about ideas far beyond her station." He moved closer to Melina's chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "I love her gentleness with things that can't protect themselves. Stray cats, dying flowers, people who are suffering. I love the way she hums when she's happy, always the same haunting melody that makes me want to learn all her songs. The specificity of his observations took Melina's breath away. These weren't generic compliments, but evidence that he'd been watching her, really seeing her, noticing details about her personality that she'd barely acknowledged to herself. "And what do you expect from her in return?" Kizzy pressed, apparently unmoved by his declaration. "Everything," Paul said simply. "Her trust, her partnership, her willingness to build something new with me. Her patience while I learn how to be the kind of husband she deserves, rather than the kind my upbringing prepared me to be." "And if she can't give you children?" The question was brutal in its directness, and Melina gasped at her sister's cruelty. But Kizzy's eyes remained fixed on Paul, watching for his reaction to this ultimate test. Paul's face went very still, and for a moment Melina feared the worst. Then he smiled, and the expression was so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. "Then we'll love each other anyway," he said quietly. "Children would be a blessing, but they wouldn't be the foundation of our marriage. Melina would be. Our love for each other, our commitment to building something lasting. That would be enough." Kizzy studied him for a long moment, her fever-bright eyes searching his face for signs of deception or doubt. Finally, she nodded slowly. "You might actually mean that," she said, her voice softer than it had been since Paul's arrival. "I do mean it," Paul replied. "Every word." Kizzy turned to her sister, her expression still serious but no longer hostile. "It's your choice, honey, but if you go with him, go with your eyes open. Marriage isn't a fairy tale, and love isn't always enough to overcome the obstacles you'll face." "I know," Melina said quietly. "But maybe it's worth trying anyway." "Maybe it is," Kizzy agreed. She reached for Melina's hand, squeezing it with what little strength she had. "Just promise me something. Promise me you'll remember who you are, no matter how much your life changes. Promise me you won't lose yourself in trying to become whatever you think he wants you to be." "I promise," Melina whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Good." Kizzy's smile was tired but genuine. "Then go build your new life, sister. And if it turns out to be everything you've dreamed of, write and tell me all about it." As Paul helped Melina gather her few belongings, she felt the weight of her sister's blessing and her warning in equal measure. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility but shadowed with uncertainty. But for the first time in her life, uncertainty didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like freedom. Chapter 5. The Dance of Hearts. The whole town would be talking about this moment for years to come. But as Paul Hogan extended his hand to Melina Bavuma on the crowded dance floor of the Harvest Festival, neither of them cared about anything beyond the thundering of their hearts and the sweet, dangerous thrill of dancing their love into the light. The fiddle's melody soared above the laughter and conversation of the assembled townspeople, its notes weaving through the autumn air like golden threads, binding together a tapestry of celebration. Paper lanterns swayed in the evening breeze, casting warm pools of amber light across the makeshift dance floor that had been erected in the town square for the annual festival that brought together all levels of society, from the wealthiest estate owners to the humblest field workers. Melina stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Paul navigate the social currents with the easy confidence of a man who'd never doubted his right to be anywhere he chose. Tomorrow they would be married. Tomorrow they would begin their journey to California and the new life he'd promised her. But tonight, she was still Melina Bavuma, the Bushman maid who had no business drawing the attention of millionaires. She'd dressed carefully for the evening, choosing the deep blue dress that Kizzy had sewn for her months ago, the finest thing she'd ever owned, made from fabric her sister had saved money for weeks to buy. The color brought out the warmth in her dark skin and made her eyes shine like stars, but she felt exposed under the curious gazes of the townspeople who weren't used to seeing servants dressed like ladies. "You look absolutely radiant tonight," Racine Montgomery said softly, appearing at Melina's elbow with 2 cups of spiced cider. The local florist was one of the few people in town who'd always treated Melina with genuine kindness, perhaps because she understood what it meant to work with her hands and depend on the goodwill of others for survival. "Thank you," Melina murmured, accepting the warm cup gratefully. Her hands were trembling, and she hoped Racine wouldn't notice the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from her very pores. "It's a beautiful celebration." "It is indeed," Racine agreed, but her brown eyes were sharp with concern as she studied her friend's face. "Though I can't help but notice you seem different tonight. There's something about you that's positively glowing. Good news, I hope?" Before Melina could answer, the crowd shifted and parted like the Red Sea before Moses, and Paul emerged from the throng of dancers like a vision that had stepped out of her most impossible dreams. He'd abandoned his usual formal attire for simple dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar. But somehow he looked more magnificent than ever. His gray eyes scanned the crowd with predatory intensity until they found hers, and the impact of his gaze hit her like lightning splitting the summer sky. The conversations around them seemed to fade into meaningless noise as Paul moved toward her with deliberate purpose, ignoring the whispered comments and curious stares that followed in his wake. Mrs. Perpetua Hayes was watching them with avid curiosity from her position near the refreshment table. Pascal Grosjean, Paul's business partner who'd arrived that afternoon from New York, observed their interaction with calculating coldness that made Melina's skin crawl. "Excuse me," she whispered to Racine, setting down her untouched cider and moving toward Paul as if pulled by invisible strings that connected her heart to his across the impossible distance of class and race and social expectation. They met near the edge of the dancing area, where couples spun and swayed to the fiddle's tune under strings of paper lanterns that cast everything in warm, golden light. Paul's hand brushed hers, so briefly it might have been accidental, but the touch sent fire racing through her veins like whiskey on an empty stomach. "You came," he said quietly, his voice pitched low beneath the music and laughter that surrounded them. "I said I would," Melina replied, though in truth she'd changed her mind a dozen times before finally working up the courage to leave Mrs. Beauchemin's estate. The weight of tomorrow's plans pressed against her chest like a physical presence. The train tickets hidden in her room, the small satchel packed with her few precious belongings, the future that stretched ahead of them, bright with promise and shadowed with uncertainty. "You're the most beautiful woman here," Paul said, his eyes drinking in every detail of her appearance with an intensity that made her cheeks flame. "Though I suppose I'm biased, since you're the most beautiful woman everywhere, as far as I'm concerned." Heat flooded her face at the compliment, delivered with such sincere conviction that she couldn't doubt his sincerity. Around them, she could feel the weight of watching eyes, the pressure of whispered conversations that stopped when people noticed her looking in their direction. "Paul, people are watching," she murmured, acutely aware that every moment they spent in conversation was being catalogued and dissected by minds that had nothing better to occupy them. "Let them watch," he said, his voice carrying a note of steel beneath the velvet. "Let them see what it looks like when a man claims the woman he loves." The word "claims" sent shivers through her that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. There was something possessive about the way Paul looked at her, something that spoke of ownership rather than partnership. But before she could examine that feeling too closely, the fiddle music swelled into a waltz, and couples began forming on the makeshift dance floor. Paul extended his hand with old-world courtesy, his eyes never leaving hers. "Dance with me," he said simply. "I can't," Melina whispered, but even as she said it, she could feel her resistance crumbling like sand before the tide. "People will talk. Mrs. Beauchemin will hear about it. I could lose my position. "You're not going to need your position much longer," Paul pointed out gently, "and they're already talking. The question is whether we're going to live our lives according to their expectations or our own desires." The reminder of their plans, tomorrow's escape, the marriage that would transform her from servant to wife, the journey to California that would carry them far from the judgmental eyes of this small southern town, gave her the courage she needed. If this was to be their last night in the world that had shaped them both, then perhaps it was fitting that they should dance their defiance into the light. She placed her hand in his. The touch was electric, sending shockwaves up her arm and straight to her heart. Paul's fingers closed around hers with gentle strength as he led her onto the dance floor, and suddenly nothing else mattered. Not the staring faces, not the whispered conversations, not the weight of societal expectations that pressed down on them like stones. Paul's other hand settled at her waist, proper and respectful, but burning through the fabric of her dress like a brand. As they began to move to the music, Melina felt herself falling into a dream she'd never dared to have. He was an excellent dancer, leading her through the steps with an easy confidence that made her feel graceful and cherished and absolutely precious. "You dance beautifully," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as they moved together in perfect synchronization. "I've never waltzed before," she admitted, marveling at how natural it felt to move with him, as if they'd been dancing together for years instead of minutes. Her body seemed to know instinctively how to follow his lead, how to anticipate his movements and flow with them like water following the contours of its container. "Could have fooled me," Paul said with a smile that made her heart flutter like a caged bird beating its wings against the bars. "You move like you were born to it, like you were made to dance in my arms." As they spun across the makeshift floor, Melina caught glimpses of the crowd watching them with expressions that ranged from mere curiosity to outright shock. Some faces showed disapproval so thick you could cut it with a knife. Others displayed a kind of horrified fascination, as if they were witnessing a carriage accident in slow motion. But there were also expressions of something that might have been wonder, as if seeing them together had opened a door to possibilities people hadn't dared imagine. "They're all staring," she whispered, though she found she cared less than she'd expected. The music was weaving a spell around them, creating a bubble of intimacy that seemed to exclude the rest of the world. "Of course they are," Paul said, spinning her gently and drawing her back into his arms with a flourish that made her laugh despite her nervousness. "They're witnessing something remarkable, two people refusing to let the world dictate whom they can love." The word love sent shivers through her, just as it had every time he'd spoken it over the past few days. But here, surrounded by music and moonlight, with his hands guiding her through steps she'd only dreamed of learning, it felt less like an impossible fantasy and more like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. "Tomorrow," Paul said softly, his lips close to her ear as they moved together, "we'll dance at our wedding. Just you and me and the minister and witnesses who don't know enough about us to disapprove." "And after that?" she asked, allowing herself to be swept away by the romantic vision he was painting. "After that, we'll dance in our own home, with our children watching and laughing," Paul said, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll teach them that love is something to be celebrated, not hidden away like a shameful secret." The image was so vivid, so achingly beautiful, that it took her breath away. She could see it all: children with Paul's gray eyes and her dark skin, a house filled with laughter and music, a life built on love rather than compromise. "What if they don't accept us?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since she'd agreed to his proposal. "What if California isn't the paradise you're imagining?" Paul's arms tightened around her protectively. "Then we'll make our own paradise," he said with quiet conviction. "We'll build something so beautiful, so strong, that it won't matter what anyone else thinks." When the music ended, they stood still for a moment longer than strictly proper, hands still joined, eyes locked in a communication that transcended words. The spell was broken by polite applause from the other dancers, but the magic lingered between them like perfume in the air. "Thank you," Paul said formally, bowing over her hand in a gesture that was perfectly appropriate and utterly inadequate for what had just passed between them. "Thank you," Melina replied, dropping a curtsy that felt like an echo from another life, the life she was leaving behind tomorrow for something infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more precious. As Paul melted back into the crowd, apparently to avoid arousing more suspicion than they already had, Melina found herself surrounded by curious faces and barely contained questions. But she barely heard the whispered conversations or saw the speculative glances. Her entire world had narrowed to the memory of Paul's hands on her waist, the warmth in his eyes as he looked at her like she was the only woman in existence. "Well, that was quite a performance," a sharp voice said behind her, cutting through her romantic reverie like a blade through silk. Melina turned to find Pascal Grosjean watching her with cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. She'd seen him around the estate over the past few weeks, a thin man with aristocratic features and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Everything about him set her teeth on edge, from his perfectly tailored clothes to the way he looked at her as if she were an insect he was considering crushing. "I'm sorry," she said politely, though something in his manner made her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. "That touching display with my associate," Pascal clarified, his French accent making the words sound even more condescending than they already were. "I do hope you're not laboring under any delusions about where such friendships lead for women in your position." The warning was clear, wrapped in false courtesy, but sharp as a newly honed blade. Melina lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of dignity she hadn't known she possessed until this moment. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mr. Grosjean," she said with carefully modulated politeness. "Of course you don't," Pascal said with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth whatsoever. "But perhaps it would be wise to remember that men like Paul Hogan have certain obligations to their families, their businesses, their social positions. Temporary fascinations rarely survive such realities, my dear. Rarely." Each word was calculated to wound, to remind her of all the reasons why what she felt for Paul was foolish and doomed to end in heartbreak. But instead of the crushing despair she might have expected, Melina felt something else entirely, a fierce, protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. "Perhaps," she said quietly, meeting his cold gaze with steady eyes, "you should let Mr. Hogan speak for himself about his obligations." Pascal's eyes narrowed at her refusal to be cowed, and for a moment she saw something dangerous flicker in their pale depths. "Indeed," he said softly, "though I suspect he'll find his voice soon enough when certain pressures make his position clear. Family can be quite persuasive when they put their minds to it." With that cryptic threat, he disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Melina standing alone with her heart racing and her mind spinning with questions. What pressures was he talking about? What did Paul's family know about their plans? And what kind of power did they wield that could threaten even a man with Paul's wealth and determination? Across the square, she caught sight of Paul, deep in conversation with Booker Cross, his closest friend who'd arrived that afternoon from New York. Both men looked serious, their heads bent together in urgent discussion that made her stomach clench with sudden foreboding. Whatever they were discussing, it was clear that it wasn't pleasant news. As the festival continued around her, the magic of their dance began to fade, replaced by the cold reality of the forces aligned against them. But underneath the fear, something else was growing, a determination she'd never expected to feel, a fierce protectiveness for the future they were trying to build together. Let Pascal Grosjean make his threats. Let Paul's family try to interfere with their plans. Tonight she danced in Paul Hogan's arms as if she belonged there, and no one could take that away from her. Tomorrow they would begin building a life where every night could end with dancing, where love would be celebrated rather than hidden, where their children would grow up knowing that anything was possible when two hearts refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them. The question was, would they have the strength to protect that dream from all the forces trying to destroy it? Chapter 6. Torn Between Worlds. You magnificent, deluded fool, what have you done? Booker Cross's voice carried the weight of 20 years of friendship and the sharp edge of barely controlled panic as he gripped Paul's shoulder in the shadowy alcove behind the festival refreshment tent, his dark eyes blazing with urgency that cut through the distant sounds of music and laughter like a knife through silk. Paul shrugged away from his friend's grasp, his jaw set with the kind of stubborn determination that Booker recognized from their Harvard days. When Paul had decided to challenge a professor's racist theories about intelligence and skin color, despite warnings that such confrontations could damage his academic standing. That same reckless idealism was burning in his gray eyes now, magnified by something Booker had never seen before, the desperate conviction of a man who believed he'd found something worth dying for. "I've fallen in love," Paul said simply, as if those 4 words could explain the telegram Booker had received from Paul's father, the emergency trip from New York, the careful instructions about bringing their mutual friend home before he destroyed everything their families had spent generations building. "With a black woman," Booker said, and though his voice held no judgment, he'd known Paul too long to doubt the sincerity of his feelings. The stark reality of the words hung in the air between them like a sword suspended by a thread. "Paul, I've known you since we were boys, sneaking out of dormitories to attend underground abolition meetings. I've watched you charm your way out of every scrape, talk your way around every obstacle. But this isn't something you can negotiate or manipulate your way through." "I know what she is," Paul said quietly, and there was steel in his voice that Booker had rarely heard, the tone of a man who'd counted the cost and found it acceptable. "I also know what she means to me. I know that I'd rather spend 1 year loving her completely than a lifetime pretending to care about women who leave me feeling empty inside." Booker stopped his agitated pacing and turned to face his friend fully, studying the face he'd known since childhood for signs of the madness that seemed to have infected Paul's usually pragmatic mind. At 35, Booker was 3 years older than Paul, with the kind of sharp political intelligence that had made him indispensable in their overlapping business and social circles. His marriage to Senator Morrison's daughter had elevated both their standings in New York society, but it had also given him intimate knowledge of how quickly that same society could turn on those who violated its unwritten rules. "Do you?" Booker asked, his voice carrying years of hard-won wisdom. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to throw away everything, your inheritance, your reputation, your entire future, for a woman who can never be anything more to you than a secret shame." The words hit Paul like physical blows, each one designed to cut through the romantic haze that had surrounded him for weeks. He stepped closer to Booker, his hands clenching into fists at his sides as his temper finally flared to match his friend's intensity. "Don't," he said, his voice dangerous with warning. "Don't you dare talk about her like that. Don't you dare reduce what we have to some sordid arrangement based on forbidden lust." "Like what?" "Like the reality of what she is in the world we live in." Booker's voice rose slightly before he caught himself and glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Paul, I'm trying to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life. Your father is already suspicious about why you've extended this trip so many times. When he received my telegram describing tonight's public display, he nearly had apoplexy. You contacted my father." Paul's voice was deadly quiet, and for the first time in their long friendship, Booker saw something that might have been real danger in his gray eyes. "I had to," Booker said, though he had the grace to look uncomfortable about the betrayal. "Paul, you're not thinking clearly. You're so caught up in the romance of defying society that you can't see the practical consequences of what you're proposing." "And what consequences are those?" Paul asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Booker pulled a leather portfolio from his jacket, extracting several official-looking documents that he handed to Paul with obvious reluctance. "These arrived on today's train. Your father has had his lawyers working around the clock since he suspected what was happening down here." Paul's face went white as he scanned the papers, his hands trembling slightly as the legal language painted a picture of systematic destruction that would follow any attempt to marry Melina. "He can't do this," he whispered. "He can and he will," Booker said gently. "Complete disinheritance is just the beginning. He's prepared to use every business connection, every political favor, every social obligation to ensure that no reputable firm will do business with you. Your credit lines will be canceled, your club memberships revoked, your name struck from every guest list that matters." "I don't care about any of that," Paul said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Don't you?" Booker pressed. "What about when you realize you can't support the lifestyle you've promised her? What about when your children are denied access to decent schools because no respectable institution will accept them? What about when you're watching other men receive opportunities that you'll never see again because of choices you made in a moment of romantic fever?" Paul turned away, staring out at the festival where he could see Melina moving through the crowd like a dream made flesh, her blue dress catching the lantern light as she spoke with other townspeople who would never again treat her with such easy acceptance once word of tonight's dance spread beyond this small gathering. "There's more," Booker said quietly, producing another document from his portfolio. "Your father has been making inquiries about Miss Bavuma's background, her sister's medical bills, her employment history, her family's financial situation. He's prepared to have her arrested on charges of theft, if necessary." "Theft?" Paul spun around, his face dark with outrage. "She's never stolen anything in her life." "That's not the point," Booker said with the patient tone of someone explaining simple economics to a child. "The point is that accusations can be made, evidence can be manufactured, and a black woman's word against a white man's carries very little weight in any court you'd care to name. Your father has enough influence to ensure she's convicted whether she's guilty or not." The threat hit its mark, and Paul sank onto a nearby hay bale as the full extent of his father's power became clear. He'd been thinking like a romantic hero, imagining that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. But his father was thinking like a general, using strategy and superior resources to eliminate threats to his family's position. "What does he want?" Paul asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Complete surrender," Booker said simply. "You return to New York immediately, marry Constance Whitmore as originally planned, and never contact Miss Bavuma again. In exchange, the charges against her disappear, and she keeps her position here indefinitely." "And if I refuse?" Booker's expression was genuinely sympathetic. "Then you'll both be destroyed, but she'll bear the worst of it. You'll be disgraced and disinherited, but you're still a white man with education and connections. She'll be a black woman with a criminal record and no references. Which one of you do you think will survive that better?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Paul felt something crack inside his chest, a sound like his heart breaking in real time. Everything he'd built with Melina, every dream they'd shared, every promise he'd made, all of it balanced on the edge of a knife held by a man who would never hesitate to cut. "You bastard," Paul whispered, though whether he was addressing Booker or his father wasn't entirely clear. "I'm trying to be your friend," Booker said quietly. The friend who tells you hard truths instead of comfortable lies. Paul, I've seen you in love before, or what you thought was love. This feels different because it's forbidden, because it makes you feel noble and progressive and brave. But when the novelty wears off and you're facing the daily reality of being cut off from everything you've ever known, will you still feel the same way? Yes, Paul said immediately, but even he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. What about her? Booker pressed. What happens to her when you start to resent the sacrifices you've made, when you look at your mixed-race children and wonder what kind of life they'll have in a world that sees them as neither black nor white, when you're watching your friends advance in careers that are forever closed to you? The questions hit their mark, digging into fears that Paul had been trying to ignore for days. He'd been so focused on the intensity of his feelings for Melina, so caught up in the romance of defying society's expectations, that he'd barely considered the practical realities of what he was proposing to both of them. I would never resent her, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Not now, Booker agreed. Not while you're drunk on the thrill of forbidden love and the excitement of rebellion. But what about in 5 years? 10? When the children you want so desperately are old enough to understand why doors are closed to them, why they're not welcome in the places their father grew up. Before Paul could answer, Pascal Grosjean emerged from the shadows at the edge of their alcove, his pale eyes glittering with satisfaction as he approached the two Americans. Paul's business partner moved with the predatory grace of a man who sensed weakness and was prepared to exploit it. Gentlemen, Pascal said smoothly, his French accent lending an air of sophistication to words that carried an unmistakable threat. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. What do you want, Pascal? Paul asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Merely to congratulate you on tonight's performance, Pascal replied, settling onto another hay bale as if he owned the space. Quite touching, really, though I must say I'm curious about how you plan to explain it to our potential investors. Paul's blood ran cold. What investors? Pascal's smile was sharp as cut glass. Why, the consortium that's been considering backing our California venture, of course. Surely you remember. The railroad interests, the mining concerns, the shipping companies that could make or break our expansion plans? What does that have to do with anything? Paul demanded, though he was beginning to suspect he knew where this conversation was heading. Everything, mon ami, Pascal said with false sympathy. You see, these are conservative men with traditional values, the kind of men who take a very dim view of business partners who engage in, shall we say, unconventional relationships. They tend to question the judgment of men who make such choices, to wonder what other poor decisions they might make with investors' money. The threat was clear, and Paul felt another piece of his carefully constructed future crumble into dust. The California venture wasn't just a business opportunity. It was supposed to be the foundation of the new life he'd promised Melina, the source of the independence that would allow them to build something beautiful together. You're blackmailing me, he said quietly. I'm protecting our mutual interests, Pascal corrected smoothly. The choice is entirely yours, of course. Continue this romantic folly and watch our business prospects evaporate, or make the sensible decision and secure a future that benefits everyone involved. Paul looked from Pascal's calculating face to Booker's sympathetic expression, feeling the walls of his privileged world closing in around him like the bars of a beautifully decorated cage. Everything he'd thought he could control, every advantage he'd believed would protect the woman he loved, was being systematically stripped away by men who understood power in ways his romantic idealism had never prepared him for. What if I walk away from all of it? He asked desperately. The business, the family money, the social connections. What if I choose love over everything else? Then you'll doom her along with yourself, Booker said gently. And Paul, if you really love her as much as you claim, Can you live with that? Can you live with knowing that your choices destroyed the woman you say you want to protect? The question hung in the air like a death sentence, and Paul felt his romantic dreams colliding with the brutal realities of the world they lived in. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the festival continuing, could imagine Melina moving through the crowd like the graceful, dignified woman she was, unaware that the future they'd planned together was being systematically demolished by forces beyond either of their control. He thought about the promises he'd made to her, the dreams they'd shared, the children he'd wanted to give her. Then he thought about what those children would face in a world that would see them as abominations, what Melina would endure as the wife of a disgraced outcast, what he would become when the weight of those sacrifices finally broke something essential inside him. For the first time since he'd fallen under Melina's spell, Paul Hogan began to understand that love might not be enough, after all. Chapter 7. The Letter. The morning sun felt like an accusation streaming through Melina's bedroom window as she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the letter from Paul trembling in her hands like a living thing that carried the power to either save her heart or shatter it into pieces too small to ever reassemble. 3 sleepless hours had passed since Roscoe Van Nys had knocked softly on the servant's entrance, his weathered face apologetic as he handed her the sealed envelope that bore her name in Paul's distinctive handwriting. She'd known immediately that something was wrong. Paul had never sent written messages before, preferring stolen conversations in shadowy corners and moonlit gardens where words could be accompanied by touches that set her soul on fire. Now, with dawn breaking gray and cold outside her window, she held the answer to questions she'd been afraid to ask since Pascal Grosjean's threatening words at the festival. The elegant script seemed to mock her with its careful formality, as if the man who'd promised to make her his wife had suddenly remembered the proper distance that should exist between a millionaire and his maid. My dearest Melina. The letter began, and already she could feel tears gathering behind her eyes, because something in that formal address told her everything she needed to know about what was coming. By the time you read these words, I will be gone. Not because I wanted to leave you, but because staying would have destroyed us both in ways I was too blinded by love to see clearly before now. Her hands stilled on the paper, her breathing shallow as the meaning of his words began to sink in. Gone. He was gone, vanished from her life as suddenly as he'd entered it, leaving nothing behind but ink on paper and the memory of dancing in his arms under paper lanterns while the whole world watched their impossible love unfold. I know how this must seem to you, like betrayal, like abandonment, like proof that every warning you received about men like me was justified. But I need you to understand that leaving you is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, and I'm only doing it because I love you too much to drag you down with me. Melina's vision blurred as tears began to fall in earnest, splashing onto the parchment and threatening to smear his carefully chosen words. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and forced herself to continue reading, though every instinct screamed at her to burn the letter and pretend it had never existed. Last night, after our dance, I was forced to confront truths I'd been avoiding since the moment I first saw you, arranging flowers in Mrs. Beauchemin's front hall. I've been living in a fantasy, believing that love could overcome the barriers between us, that the strength of what I feel for you could somehow rewrite the rules of the world we live in. But love, as much as it pains me to admit this, is not enough. Not in this time, not in this place. Not for people like us who come from such different worlds. She wanted to throw the letter away, to burn it and pretend it had never existed. But she couldn't stop reading, couldn't stop torturing herself with his elegant explanations for why their love was impossible, why the dreams they'd shared were nothing more than romantic delusions. My friend Booker made me see what I was too blind with passion to recognize. That by pursuing you, I wasn't saving you from your circumstances, I was condemning you to something far worse. A woman who loves me can never be more than a secret shame, hidden away from the world that would destroy us both if it knew the truth. I thought about taking you to California, about building that new world I promised you. But what kind of world would it be? You would be cut off from every opportunity, every comfort, every basic dignity that should be yours by right. Our children would be outcasts, denied access to schools and society, carrying the burden of our choices for the rest of their lives. The mention of children, the children he'd wanted to give her, the babies he'd spoken of with such tender longing, hit her like a physical blow. She pressed her free hand to her stomach, remembering the way his eyes had darkened when he'd spoken of watching her grow round with his child, of building a family that would outlast them both. I won't do that to you, my darling. I won't ask you to sacrifice everything you are and everything you could become for the sake of my selfish desires. You deserve better than a half-life lived in shadows. You deserve better than me. No, she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking on the single word. You're wrong. But even as she spoke the denial, she could see the truth in his reasoning. She'd felt it herself during their stolen moments together, the weight of eyes watching them, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the growing sense that she was balanced on the edge of a precipice that would destroy her reputation and her sister's future if she fell. Mrs. Boschman has been more than generous. She's agreed to provide you with excellent references should you choose to seek other employment, and she's assured me that your position here is secure for as long as you want it. I've also made arrangements for your sister's medical care. Dr. Orson Ashworth has been instructed to provide whatever treatment she needs, with all expenses paid by an anonymous benefactor, proud to accept charity. But please don't let that pride prevent Kizzy from getting the help she needs. Consider it not a gift from me, but payment of a debt I owe for the weeks of happiness you gave me when I had no right to ask for even a moment of your time. Melina's tears were falling freely now, great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. He was trying to take care of her even as he abandoned her, trying to ease his own guilt by ensuring she and Kizzy would be provided for. The thoughtfulness of it only made his betrayal hurt worse, because it proved that some part of him really did love her, just not enough to fight for her. I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the most real, the most alive I've ever felt. You made me remember what it was like to dream of something beyond money and social standing. You made me want to be worthy of the way you looked at me when you thought no one was watching. If I could rewrite the world for you, I would. If I could tear down every barrier between us and build something beautiful in the ruins, I would do it gladly. But I can't. All I can do is love you enough to let you go. Please don't think too harshly of me. Please remember the man who danced with you at the festival, who kissed you under the roses, who saw in you everything beautiful and good and worth fighting for in this world. That man was real, even if he was too weak to fight the battles that would have given us the life we both wanted. The letter continued for several more paragraphs, each one a carefully crafted knife blade designed to cut away another piece of her heart. He wrote about the memories he would carry, about the impact she'd had on his understanding of love and courage and the kind of person he wanted to be. He wrote about hoping she would find someone worthy of her, someone who could give her the life she deserved in the bright light of day, instead of hidden away in shadows. Be happy, my darling. Find someone worthy of you, someone who can give you the life you deserve in the bright light of day instead of hidden away in shadows. And if you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday, know that your forgiveness would mean more to me than all the treasures in the world. Forever yours, even in separation. Paul. P.S. I've left something for you in the rose garden, beneath the oak tree where we first talked about dreams. I hope you'll think of me when you see it. Melina clutched the letter to her chest, her heart breaking with each beat. He'd tried to explain everything, to make his abandonment seem noble and necessary, but all she could feel was the crushing weight of loss and the bitter taste of betrayal. The man who'd promised to build her a new world had left her alone in the ruins of the old one. But even through her grief, she felt something else stirring. Anger. Righteous, burning anger at his presumption, at his decision to choose for both of them what their future should be. Who was he to decide she wasn't strong enough to face whatever the world threw at them? Who gave him the right to determine what she deserved or what prices she was willing to pay for love? She stood abruptly, wiping her tears and smoothing her simple gray dress. If Paul Hogan thought he could make unilateral decisions about their relationship and disappear into the night like some tragic romantic hero, he was about to learn otherwise. But first, she had to see what he'd left for her in the garden. 20 minutes later, she stood beneath the ancient oak tree where they'd shared so many stolen conversations, her breath misting in the cold morning air. At the base of the tree, nestled among the fallen leaves, was a small wooden box tied with a blue ribbon, the same shade as the dress she'd worn to dance with him. Inside, she found a delicate silver locket, its surface engraved with an intricate pattern of roses that seemed to bloom eternal in the precious metal. When she opened it, she discovered a tiny photograph of herself. Taken, she realized, during one of those moments when she'd thought she was alone in Mrs. Beauchemin's garden, when she'd allowed herself to smile freely while tending the flowers. Beneath the locket lay a small card with words written in Paul's careful script. "For the children we'll never have. May they know they were loved before they were even conceived." The message broke something inside her chest, something that had been holding her together through sheer force of will. She sank to her knees among the fallen leaves, clutching the locket to her heart as sobs racked her body with a pain so intense it felt like dying. He'd been planning this abandonment even as he made love to her with words, even as he spoke of marriage and children and building something beautiful together. The photograph proved he'd been watching her, studying her, collecting memories to take with him when he inevitably chose duty over love. But as her tears fell onto the locket, something else began to burn in her chest. A fierce determination that had sustained her through years of poverty and loss, and the thousand small humiliations that came with being black and female and poor in a world designed to crush people like her. Paul Hogan had chosen to surrender without a fight, to let other people's expectations determine the course of his life. But Melina Bavuma had been fighting for survival since she was 16 years old, and she wasn't about to stop now. Not when the stakes were love itself. If he thought a letter and a piece of jewelry could end what had grown between them, he was about to discover just how wrong a very intelligent man could be. Some things were worth fighting for, even when, especially when, the person you were fighting for had given up on himself. She stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her skirt and fastening the locket around her neck where it settled against her heart like a talisman. Paul might have run back to his comfortable cage in New York, but he'd forgotten one crucial thing about the woman he claimed to love. She knew where to find him, and she had absolutely nothing left to lose. Chapter 8. The Storm. Lightning split the October sky like God's own fury as Melina Bavuma ran through the driving rain toward the abandoned mill where desperate instinct told her she'd find Paul Hogan saying goodbye to the only place where they'd ever been truly happy together. The storm had blown in without warning, turning the peaceful autumn afternoon into chaos. For 3 weeks since receiving his letter of abandonment, she'd planned to board the evening train to New York when Mrs. Perpetua Hayes burst into Paxton Vale's bookshop with terrifying news. "There's been trouble at the old mill," Perpetua gasped, her face white with shock. That French fellow, Pascal, was asking around town about where Paul Hogan might go to be alone. Someone mentioned the mill, and now there's talk of men with guns. Melina had dropped everything and run, her heart hammering with terror. The mill loomed ahead through the rain, a dark silhouette against the storm-torn sky. She burst through the door, her wet skirts clinging to her legs. "Paul," she called, her voice nearly swallowed by thunder. "Melina?" His voice came from the shadows, filled with shock. "Dear God, what are you doing here?" He emerged from the darkness, his shirt torn and stained with blood, a purple bruise spreading across his cheek. "You're hurt!" She rushed toward him. "It's nothing," Paul said, catching her wrists. "But you shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "What happened? Where's Pascal?" "Gone. For now, but he'll be back with reinforcements. You need to leave immediately." "Not without you," Melina said fiercely. "Not again." "No." The word exploded from her with 3 weeks' worth of suppressed anger. "You don't get to make that decision for me anymore, Paul Hogan. You don't get to decide what I can handle, what I deserve, what prices I'm willing to pay for love." Thunder crashed overhead. Paul stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, not as the fragile creature he needed to protect, but as the fierce woman who'd been fighting battles he couldn't imagine. "You read my letter," he said quietly. "Every word," she confirmed, her eyes blazing. "Every self-righteous, cowardly, presumptuous word." Paul flinched. Cowardly? What else would you call it? A man who claims to love a woman but abandons her without asking what she wants. A man who makes decisions about their shared future based on his own fears instead of her courage. "I was trying to protect you." "From what? From choosing my own life?" She laughed bitterly. "Paul, I've been fighting battles you can't imagine since I was old enough to walk. I've fought poverty, prejudice, illness, despair. Do you really think I'm afraid of fighting for love?" The words stripped away the noble justifications he'd built around his decision to leave. In the flickering light, Melina looked like an avenging angel, magnificent in her fury. "What about your sister? Your position, your security?" "Kizzy told me to fight for you," Melina said simply. "She said she'd rather see me try and fail than spend my life wondering. As for my position, Mrs. Beauchemin dismissed me 2 days after you left, when she discovered I was planning to follow you to New York." Paul felt the bottom drop out of his world. "She what?" "She said she couldn't risk having a lovesick fool in her employ. So you see, all your noble sacrifices were for nothing. I've already lost everything you were trying to protect." The revelation staggered him. Everything he'd done had been rendered meaningless. He'd abandoned the woman he loved to protect her position, only to discover his abandonment itself had cost her that protection. "Melina, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize," she said fiercely. "Don't you dare apologize for being loved by someone brave enough to fight for it." The sound of approaching horses cut through the storm. Paul's face went white as he grabbed her arm. "They're back. Pascal must have gone for help." "My father sent Pascal to bring me home by force if necessary," Paul explained grimly. "When I refused, he made it clear there would be consequences for me and anyone I cared about." "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that involve hired men and accidents that can't be traced back to respectable businessmen," Paul said quietly. "He's done it before." The horses were closer now. Paul turned from the window, his face set with sudden resolve. "There's a back entrance through the grain chute. You can slip out while they come through the front." "No," Melina said simply. "I'm not leaving you." She took his bruised face in her hands. "For better or worse, we face this together. That's what love means, Paul. Not protecting each other from difficult choices, but standing side by side when those choices get dangerous." Something shifted in his expression. Love, but also respect for the woman who refused to be saved from her own decisions. "Together," he said quietly, and kissed her with desperate tenderness as the mill door burst open and Pascal Grosjean strode in from the storm, flanked by 3 men whose faces promised violence. "How touching," Pascal said, his pale eyes glittering. The star-crossed lovers, united at last in their final moments. Paul stepped protectively in front of Melina. Let her go, Pascal. Your quarrel is with me. My quarrel is with anyone who threatens the natural order, Pascal replied smoothly, signaling to his men. Your father was quite specific. Complete separation, permanent and irreversible. You're making a mistake, Paul said, steel in his voice. I'm not the pampered fool you think I am, and she's not some helpless victim you can intimidate. As Pascal's men closed in, Melina felt crystalline clarity wash over her. She'd spent her life avoiding confrontation, but standing here with Paul, facing down everything that had kept them apart, she felt fierce joy. They might not survive the next few minutes, but whatever happened, they would face it as one, and somehow that felt like the only victory they needed. Chapter 9. The Long Separation. 6 months of winter passed like a lifetime of penance, each gray dawn bringing Melina Bavuma another day of wondering if love could survive the brutal arithmetic of loss and separation when the man she'd fought for had vanished into thin air on the night their world exploded into violence and chaos. The cramped room above Paxson Vale's bookshop smelled of leather bindings and desperate hope, its single window offering a view of the main street where she watched for a familiar figure who never appeared. After that terrible night at the mill, when Pascal's men had tried to separate them by force, and Paul had fought like a man possessed, until Sheriff Rockwell's arrival scattered the hired thugs into the storm. Everything had changed with devastating swiftness. Paul had been arrested on charges of assault, then mysteriously released 12 hours later, when equally mysterious legal documents appeared to make the entire incident disappear from official records. But by the time Melina had discovered his release, he was gone, spirited away in the night by men whose faces she never saw, whose names she never learned. Still watching for ghosts? Kizzy's voice was noticeably weaker now, the winter having carved away what little strength her illness had spared. But her spirit remained as fierce as ever as she watched her sister from the narrow bed they shared. He's not a ghost, Melina said quietly, her breath fogging the cold glass. He's in New York, fighting battles we can't see. Fighting or surrendering? The question was gentle but pointed, the kind of truth only sisters could speak without cruelty. Melina turned from the window, her heart clenching at the sight of Kizzy's wasted form beneath the pile of quilts. The medicine Paul had arranged was still being provided by the mysterious anonymous benefactor, but it was fighting a losing battle against the disease that had been slowly claiming her sister's strength over the past 18 months. Dr. Orson Ashworth visited twice a week, his kind face growing more worried with each examination, though he tried to hide his concern behind professional optimism. I don't know, Melina admitted, sinking into the chair beside the bed. His letters stopped coming 2 months ago. Before that, they were getting shorter, more distant. Each one felt like he was slipping further away from me. She didn't mention what those final letters had contained. Desperate apologies for the legal and financial pressures his father was applying, explanations of business complications that kept him trapped in New York, promises that grew hazier with each passing week. She could read between the lines. Paul Hogan was drowning in the consequences of loving her, and the man who'd once promised to rewrite the world was struggling just to survive in his old one. Maybe it's time to stop waiting, Kizzy said gently, struggling to sit up despite the obvious pain the movement caused. What do you mean? I mean, maybe it's time to make your own choices instead of waiting for him to make them for you. Kizzy's dark eyes, still bright with intelligence despite her physical decline, fixed on her sister with laser intensity. You've been living in limbo for months, honey, not moving forward, not moving back, just existing. The words stung because they were true. Since that night at the mill when Paul had been torn away from her by forces beyond either of their control, Melina had felt suspended between hope and despair. She'd managed to secure this small room through Paxson's kindness, had found work doing embroidery for ladies in the surrounding counties, had created a modest but stable life for herself and Kizzy. But it felt like she was sleepwalking through someone else's existence, waiting for her real life to begin again. "What would you have me do?" Melina asked, though she suspected she knew where this conversation was heading. "Chase after him to New York, show up at his door like some desperate fool." "Yes," Kizzy said without hesitation. "Exactly that." Melina stared at her sister in shock. "Kizzy, you think I don't know what's happening here?" Kizzy's eyes were bright with fever and determination. "You think I can't feel time running out? Honey, the doctor told me last week that I have maybe 3 months left, maybe 4 if the spring weather helps my breathing. Do you really think I want to spend that time watching you waste away from regret?" The brutal honesty hit Melina like a slap. They'd been dancing around Kizzy's deteriorating condition for months, maintaining polite fictions about recovery and spring bringing renewed strength. But winter was ending, and spring would bring only more loss. "I can't leave you," Melina whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "You can't save me either," Kizzy replied with devastating gentleness. "The medicine helps with the pain, but we both know it's not going to cure anything. I'm dying, Melina. The only question is whether you're going to let me take your future with me." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, final and irrevocable. Melina had known this day would come, had seen it approaching with each coughing fit that left Kizzy gasping for breath, each morning when her sister seemed a little more transparent, a little further away from the world of the living. "What if I go to New York and he rejects me?" Melina asked, voicing the fear that had kept her paralyzed for months. "What if 6 months of his father's pressure have convinced him that we were just a beautiful mistake?" "Then you'll know," Kizzy said simply. "And knowing will let you move forward instead of spending the rest of your life wondering. But what if you're wrong? What if he's waiting for you to show him that love is worth fighting for? What if all he needs is to see that you haven't given up on what you built together?" The possibility hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. For months, Melina had been telling herself that respecting Paul's silence meant staying away, giving him space to rebuild his life without the complications she represented. But what if her silence was being interpreted as abandonment? What if he needed her courage as much as she needed his? "I don't have money for train fare to New York," she said, but even as she spoke the words, she could hear the capitulation in her voice. "Paxson has been selling your embroidery work to ladies in Richmond and Charleston," Kizzy said with a smile that transformed her wan face. "He's been saving the money for you, waiting for the day you'd need it for something important. He says he has enough for train fare and a week's lodging in a respectable boarding house." Melina felt something crack open in her chest, some carefully guarded part of her heart that she'd kept locked away from hope. "You planned this." "I suggested it," Kizzy corrected. "Paxson did the rest because he believes in love stories with happy endings. Apparently, watching you pine away for 6 months has convinced him that some fights are worth having." The weight of their conspiracy, the evidence of so many people believing in her future, even when she'd stopped believing in it herself, was almost overwhelming. Paxson Vale, the elderly librarian who'd offered her sanctuary, had been quietly working to give her the tools she'd need to fight for her love. It was the kind of generous intervention that reminded her there was still goodness in the world, still people willing to help others reach for happiness. "What if it's too late?" she whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her dreams for months. "What if it's not?" Kizzy countered. "What if right now Paul Hogan is sitting in some fancy New York office, staring out the window and thinking about a woman who taught him what it meant to be truly alive? What if he's waiting for her to remind him that some dreams are worth fighting for? Melina looked at her sister, really looked at her, and saw not the dying woman she'd been mourning for months, but the fierce, brilliant, loving person who'd shaped every important decision of her life. Kizzy was right. She'd been existing instead of living, waiting instead of acting, letting fear disguise itself as nobility. "If I go," she said slowly, working through the logistics even as her heart began to race with possibility, "and if something happens to you while I'm gone, then I'll die knowing my sister chose love over fear," Kizzy interrupted fiercely. "And honestly, honey, I can't think of a better legacy than that." The conviction in her sister's voice, the absolute certainty that this was the right choice, gave Melina the courage she'd been lacking for months. She thought about Paul's hands cradling her face in the mill, about the way he'd looked at her as if she were everything he'd ever wanted, about the promises he'd made before the world tore them apart. "What if he's changed?" she asked, one last attempt to find a reason to stay safe, to remain in this small room where heartbreak was certain but manageable. "What if you have?" Kizzy replied with a knowing smile. "6 months ago, you were a maid who thought she wasn't worthy of love. Now you're a woman who's been tested by loss and separation and found herself strong enough to survive both. Maybe that's exactly what he needs to see." Outside the window, snow was beginning to fall, dusting the street with white that would be gray slush by morning. But for the first time in months, Melina didn't see the snow as another barrier between her and happiness. She saw it as cover for the journey she was finally ready to make. "When?" she asked, the single word committing her to more than she'd ever imagined possible. "Tomorrow morning," Kizzy said immediately, as if she'd been planning this moment for weeks. "Paxson says there's a train that leaves for Richmond at 8, with connections to New York. You could be there by Wednesday evening. 3 days. In 3 days, she could be standing in front of Paul Hogan, looking into the gray eyes that had haunted her dreams, demanding answers to questions that had been tearing her apart for months. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "What do I say to him?" she asked, suddenly aware of how unprepared she was for such a confrontation. "The truth," Kizzy said simply. "Tell him you love him. Tell him you're tired of letting other people's fears write your story. Tell him that some things are worth fighting for, even when the whole world says they're impossible." As her sister spoke, Melina felt something she'd almost forgotten stirring in her chest. Hope. Real, dangerous, magnificent hope that refused to be contained by practical considerations or reasonable fears. Paul Hogan had taught her to believe in impossible dreams. Now it was time to show him that some dreams were strong enough to survive even the harshest winter. The question was, would spring bring them back together, or would it finally teach them both to let go? Chapter 10. Love Conquers All. "I want a baby from you." Paul's voice was raw with 6 months of suppressed longing as he stood behind his mahogany desk in the opulent New York office, staring at Melina Bavuma as if she were a vision born from his most desperate prayers, the words tumbling from his lips before he could stop them. Melina felt her knees go weak as the phrase that had started everything between them echoed across the years and the miles that had separated them, carrying the same desperate hunger she remembered from that first night in Mrs. Beauchemin's library. She'd traveled for 3 days to reach this moment, had climbed the marble steps of the imposing building, had talked her way past suspicious secretaries, all to hear those exact words. "Paul," she whispered, his name carrying months of pain and hope and desperate love. He looked older. 6 months of separation had carved lines around his gray eyes, added silver to his dark hair. But when he saw her, when he truly registered that she was real, his entire face transformed with wonder. "You're here," he said, moving around the desk with unsteady steps. "Dear God, you're actually here." She stepped into the office, closing the door behind her with trembling hands. The space was magnificent, floor-to-ceiling windows, leather-bound volumes, furniture that spoke of old money. But none of it mattered, because Paul was here. "I came to give you an answer," she said simply. "What answer?" But even as he asked, she could see in his eyes that he knew. Melina took a breath that felt like swallowing lightning and spoke the words that would either save them both or destroy her completely. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I want to give you a baby. Yes, I want to marry you and build the life you promised me." Paul's face went white, then flushed with color, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "Melina, you can't come here and say that. Not after everything that's happened." "Can't I?" She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "Because that's what this has always been about, isn't it? You wanting something from me that you thought you could never have." "I thought you were safe," Paul said, his voice breaking. "I thought if I stayed away, you'd be protected." "Protected from what? From loving you? From choosing my own life?" Melina reached out and took his hands. "Paul, do you know what these 6 months have been like? Wondering if you were alive, if you were thinking of me?" "Every day," Paul whispered, his thumbs stroking across her knuckles. "I've thought about you every single day. I've walked the streets of this city trying to forget you, but I can't." "Then why did you stop writing?" Paul closed his eyes. "Because I was drowning. My father, the business, the pressure. It was like being buried alive. Every day I felt myself becoming someone I didn't recognize." "And now," Melina asked softly. "Now you're here," Paul said, wonder creeping into his voice. "You crossed half the country to find me. You're here and you're magnificent, and I remember why I was willing to give up everything for you." He cupped her face in his hands. "But, Melina, nothing has changed. My father still has the power to destroy us both. Society still won't accept what we want to build together." "Are they?" Melina smiled, and there was something in her expression that made Paul's breath catch. "Because I have some news that might change your perspective." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded newspaper. "This was in yesterday's Richmond paper. It seems there's been quite a scandal in certain New York business circles." Paul took the paper with trembling hands, his eyes widening. "Pascal Grosjean arrested for embezzlement. Business partnerships dissolved. Investigation into fraudulent investment schemes. It appears your former partner was using your father's money to finance some very questionable ventures," Melina said with satisfaction. "Ventures that have left several prominent families facing financial ruin, including, if the reports are accurate, the Hogan family fortune." Paul stared at her in shock. "How did you—" "Paxson Vale has connections in places you wouldn't expect," Melina said. "When I told him I was coming to find you, he made some inquiries. It turns out Pascal made the mistake of trying to cheat some very dangerous people." The implications hit Paul like a physical blow. If his father's fortune was compromised, then the weapons that had been used against their love were no longer available. The threat of disinheritance became meaningless when there was nothing left to inherit. "So you see," Melina continued, "maybe it's time to stop letting other people's expectations control our choices. Maybe it's time to build something entirely our own." Paul pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest. "I don't deserve you," he whispered into her hair. "Lucky for you, love isn't about deserving," Melina replied. "It's about choosing, over and over again, to fight for what matters most." "What if I fail you again?" Paul asked. "What if the pressure becomes too much?" Melina pulled back to look into his eyes. "Then I'll remind you who you are. I'll remind you that you're the man who was willing to give up everything for love, who promised to build me a world where our children could grow up free." "Our children," Paul repeated, the words carrying wonder and desperate longing. "You really want that?" Especially knowing what we'll face, Melina said fiercely. I want babies who look like both of us, who carry your determination and my practical sense. I want to raise them to believe that love is worth fighting for. Paul's smile was brilliant. How many babies? As many as God sees fit to bless us with, Melina laughed. Though I think we should start with one and see how we manage. When? The question was urgent. Well, Melina said with mock seriousness, I suppose we should get married first. Tomorrow, Paul said immediately. We'll be married tomorrow. I know a minister who'll perform the ceremony. We'll start our new life immediately. What about your business? Your life here can be rebuilt anywhere, Paul said without hesitation. I've been thinking about California. New opportunities, fewer entrenched social structures. We could start fresh there. California, Melina mused, remembering their old dreams. It sounds perfect. Not as perfect as you, Paul said sincerely, but perfect enough for our children to grow up free. Our children, she repeated, savoring the words. I love the sound of that. Paul spun her around his office as if they were dancing again under paper lanterns. As he set her down, both of them laughing with pure joy, Melina thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The fear and separation, the doubt and pain, the long winter of wondering if love could survive. It could. It had. And tomorrow they would begin building the proof that would last for generations. What do you want from me tonight? Melina asked softly, echoing the question that had started everything. Everything, Paul replied without hesitation. Your heart, your hand, your future, your children. Everything you are and everything we can become together. Then everything is what you'll have, Melina promised, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted like forever and felt like coming home. Outside the office windows, New York City bustled with its usual energy, completely unaware that in one small room, two people had just rewritten the rules of what was possible when love refused to be contained by the boundaries others tried to build around it. Love had conquered all, exactly as it was always meant to do. The end.